Welcome to Curious Conversations, where we explore the power of curiosity in philanthropy and social change. I'm Marianne Fernandez, founder of The Curious Philanthropist, an organization that helps people dream big about the positive impact they can make in the world. With our special guests, we'll explore how asking curious questions can lead to deeper impact and meaningful change. In a few moments, you'll listen to my discussion with Dr. Joshua Weiss, a negotiation and conflict resolution expert who has spent his career helping people find common ground, often in some of the most challenging situations. Josh is a global consultant, speaker, and author who works with groups and organizations around the world. He's been part of UN's mediation team, teaches through Harvard's program on negotiation, and has a real gift for making complex ideas about negotiation and leadership practical and actionable. One of the most inspiring parts of Josh's work is his role in the Abraham Path initiative. The Abraham Path is a walking route that traces the journey of Abraham, a figure shared by many cultures and faiths across the Middle East. It's a project rooted in curiosity, hospitality, and connection, designed to bring people together across divides while supporting the communities along the path. Josh was deeply involved in shaping this initiative and now serves on its board, helping to guide its growth and impact. Through this work, he's shown how something as simple as walking can spark meaningful dialogue, build bridges between people, and even foster peace. Today, we'll explore how curiosity can open doors and how, step by step, it can bring us closer to one another. Hey, Josh.
Hi, Marianne.
I am very excited about this conversation, especially since I had the pleasure of walking a couple of different pieces of the Abraham Path.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to introduce the organization and the ideas to, I hope, a lot of new people. So could you take a minute or so and just give us a quick overview of the Abraham Path Initiative?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's always great to talk to you, my friend. So the Abraham Path was really started back at the end of 2003 by a number of negotiation and conflict resolution professionals who were looking to try to find a way to bridge the gaps that seemed to be getting wider and wider between the Western world, the United States, Europe, etc., and the Middle East, and in particular, to be very frank, the Muslim world. And the thought was, that let's not work at the governmental level, at the official level, but more what could we do to kind of create more understanding from a people to people sort of cultural diplomacy kind of perspective. And my colleague, William Ury, sort of had the idea of recreating the route of Abraham as a route that people could walk and learn about the region and the people and the history and the culture and have the experience of walking in the footstep of Abraham while you're doing that and coming to understand, the nuances of the cultures that you would encounter across the region. And the idea was slowly but surely to create a route that people could travel and that kind of better understanding would come about. And we would use technology to sort of amplify people's experiences so that we would, create short videos and other kinds of things to share with the world about the other reality of the Middle East, which most people don't see. You had the opportunity to experience it, but most people don't, right? And so that was the goal. And we never thought that this would dramatically overhaul anything, but we thought this would be a nice contribution to that endeavor.
And I think it's worth mentioning that this path is goes across 6 countries, and
Yeah.
yeah,
That's right. I mean, if the whole idea with the path was it follows the story and the narratives of Abraham or Ibrahim. And there's, the Judeo-Christian narrative, and then there's the Islamic narrative. And one of the things that we were very clear about in our mind was, it wasn't for us to decide, it was for us to follow. So wherever Abraham or Ibrahim went, wherever the stories about him were recorded, we followed those. So yeah, so in the Judeo-Christian narrative, he was born in Ur of the Chaldees, which is typically thought to be Ur in southern Iraq. And so the path goes from Iraq to Turkey, down through Syria, Jordan, um, Israel, Egypt, Palestine, and then on to Saudi Arabia, where, Mecca, Medina, etc., is an homage to Abraham and Ibrahim.
Amazing. So, diving into the idea of curiosity, you had said to me in the past that going into an endeavor like this with a curious mind was really important. So, could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, so when William and I had the conversation about this idea, and we took this on as a project under a rubric of Harvard University called the Global Negotiation Initiative that we ran. And when he and I talked about this, he, shared the idea with me, and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think this is crazy and we should definitely do it." Um, and and part of my role with him, William's a real visionary kind of guy, and for me, I'm tend to be sort of the how do I take a vision and put it into reality? And in many ways, that was my job, was to help try to bring this thing to life and dust off the footprints of the path. Now, William lived in Colorado. I used to go out for meetings, and that's where he shared that with me. And when I got back to Harvard to begin to think about how to do this, I remember sitting at my computer, staring at the screen, going, I have no idea how to do this. I'm a negotiation, conflict resolution, leadership guy. Like, what do I know about helping to create a long distance walking route across the region? So William and I chatted, and we sort of came up with a plan of building credibility, starting at the international level and working our way down. But it was very much an iterative process. We would take a step forward, and then we would listen for the kind of feedback we were getting. And, one of the things that we were also really clear about was that our role at Harvard and as part of the Abraham Path Initiative was to be a catalyst for this. It wasn't, this was a route that existed. The people along the route were going to be the ones who were going to own it, nurture it, grow it, and benefit from it in different ways. And for us, it was to find partners. It was to find people who would be interested in being involved. Etc. So we were clear about our role. The One of the big challenges was, how do you get something like this going? And I engaged in a lot of negotiations to make this happen. That was, it was interesting. As I started doing this, I realized this entire endeavor was what we would call a negotiation campaign, where you have a longer term goal and you put in motion a lot of different um, ways of getting to that end goal, right? So we started at the international level and got the UN and other governments involved and supportive. And then we went to the national governments at across the region and said, look, we don't want you involved because this is really a civil society project, but we want your blessing. And we learned quickly that without a letter from the Ministry of Tourism, which was the least political entity we could work with, which is why we went there. But if we had a letter from them, then people on the ground, as you went further down from, regional governors to mayors to villages, people wanted to see that kind of thing because there were a lot of projects and people from the West that would come and try to do things, and people didn't know what to make of them. And so when they saw a letter that said, we approve of this, please feel free to be involved if you want, that's how we sort of sought to do this. But, I think it's fair to say that when we started and when I began to sort of think about how to negotiate these things, um, I had done my homework and my preparation and things like that, but there was always room for not knowing and to embrace that. And, I very much relied on colleagues that we met in the region who worked with us to be not just language interpreters, but also cultural interpreters. And that they could share with us what things really meant. One of my colleagues in Turkey, um, named Arzu, who she and I worked together for many years, and she was wonderful at saying, "Here's what they said. Here's what that really meant." Kind of thing, right? There was the yes, we love your project, or the yes, this is a very nice project. The we love your project sort of meant we wanted to be involved. The this is a very nice project meant, yeah, that's great, but we're not, we're not going to be involved. So there was a lot of, moving between high context and low context cultures. And in low context cultures, for folks who don't know, there's a lot of reading between the lines. It's a very indirect communication style. So you're constantly having to sort of ask what's really going on here, as opposed to, here in the United States where people say what they think. That's not how it works there.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm sure that you guys had a lot of questions, that you were very curious. And so when does curiosity become almost bothersome or become, a stumbling block versus help you, sort of make some gains, have advance your relationship?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll give you two answers to it. One, and it depended very much upon where we were on the path. So, for example, with Palestinians, Egyptians, and others, they actually are very entrepreneurial. And so we would just have to ask questions, and they started running with the project very quickly. They didn't wait for us. They were like, okay, great. Yeah, this is good. Like we want to be involved. And they put their entrepreneurial hat on and started getting, communities involved along a route and all kinds of things. But flip that around. So in that sense, like asking those kinds of curious questions fit well. People were comfortable, right? Empowered, etc. But in Turkey, we were working in a place called Şanlıurfa, and it's a 2 hour flight from Istanbul and Ankara. So it's in the middle of the country in a very, very different place than I think most people, when they think of Turkey, they're thinking it's a little more modern and Western in its orientation. That's not Şanlıurfa. Şanlıurfa is a honor culture place, a place where honor culture is at the heart, and it's also a feudal system that still exists with chieftains and agas who govern the particular areas. And so, um, but what was interesting is, so in the different places that we went, we put together local teams to work with us, to partner with us, and things like that. And one of the places we really struggled was Turkey, because we would say to the local teams, okay, here's the idea. How do you want to go about doing this? You live here. This is your world. This is right. And the people in Turkey, because they lived in that kind of a system, right, where like the chieftains would tell everybody what to do and they would do it, right? So there wasn't a lot of free thinking, if you will, right? And so when we asked them, how do you want to establish the path? They would say, well, you're from Harvard. You tell us. And we'd say, no, 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 we don't want to tell you. Like, you guys live here, we want you. And they were like, no, 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 you have to tell us. And so what we realized was going on was essentially that they had grown up in an environment where people always told them what to do and that they didn't have a lot of freedom to make their own decisions. And what we were asking them to do was very uncomfortable and not familiar. And so we had to pull back from that and say, okay, let's try to do this differently. Right. And we actually found a woman who you met, Allison, who had
Hmm.
married a Turkish gentleman, and she was doing something similar on it from a tourism point of view. And so we connected with her, and she was what I would call a bridging person. And bridging people proved to be really, really important in the region. Bridging people are people who understand that part of the world, but also understand the West and the way people think. Allison was from the UK, right? And so she was able to understand where we were coming from and to be able to say to us, look, in Şanlıurfa, what you're asking of people isn't going to work. And here's how you have to frame it, and here's how you have to think about it. And so we were always looking for those kinds of people who could give us insight, into what would work and why and things like that.
Yeah, she was amazing, and I agree with you about Urfa. What an amazing sort of walk through through that city. So I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, question for you is that so curiosity in the context of culture
Mm,
is what you just sort of noted and discussed. Was
yeah.
there ever a time where having this curiosity really helped shift your thinking or open a new door in what you think was, could be possible in helping people to create this path, because that's what you were doing. You were just the catalyst.
Yeah. So I think one example of that has to do with where people would stay. So one of the things that we had to think about was, okay, so if we're going to map this route, right, that follows the footsteps of Abraham Ibrahim, and people are going to walk, where are they going to stay, right? And initially we thought, well, maybe we would try to engage with the government and maybe build some pensions or little hotels along the way. But that didn't feel like the most practical idea, and we didn't really have a good answer to that question. But when we started mapping, people said, these villages are like a day's walk apart. Like that's how they evolved throughout history, right? Because people needed safety. If they were away tending to their flock, they needed at least to be able to get to the next village if something happened, right? So we thought about that, and then somebody said, well, what about a homestay program? Which was not at all like when we started, we had no idea that that might be a possibility. And at first, people were like, "Are you crazy? Like, if you did that, how would you manage the religious challenges and with men and women mixing and not mixing and all of that?" And we thought, okay, good questions. Like, these are all really good questions. And there's a there, right? That there was something to this idea. And so we just kept pursuing it. And what we did was we sort of went down the road of developing. To get started, one of the things we realized, and I think this is back to curiosity, is that some people understood the idea, other people didn't quite get it, right? And they're growing up in these small villages. I mean, when we talk about these villages, we're talking 50, 100, maybe 200 people, right? So very remote, very sort of, and a lot of people are illiterate, live on a few dollars a day. So, like, we had to begin to try to think, well, if I lived there, like, what would I be thinking about with these people who are coming and sharing this idea with us? Like we probably thought, that you might as well be on the moon for how strange of a request and things like that would be. But so what we decided to do was create model segments in each of the countries of about 100 kilometers. And then we would put those to use. We would get people coming so that we could demonstrate what we meant by people traveling and having a host and a guest relationship. And so we set up a couple of homestays to also help people to understand what we were talking about, right? So instead of saying, here's a homestay, do you want to do it? We'd say, okay, here's a homestay. Like basically what this means is, cleaning your house up in a way that travelers can stay there. You'll provide them with like breakfast and dinner and they'll stay with you. Um, and they'll pay you and, etc. And so that was, that began. And what was really interesting was when we started the model segments and things like that, people kept saying the best part of this experience is the homestays. And even though we can't really talk to the folks we're staying with in any kind of depth, at least without an interpreter, which we tackled that later, right? It was still a fascinating experience, and their hospitality was extraordinary, right? The Abrahamic hospitality is embedded in the region. It's embedded in the people, people who have so little are so generous. And so for us, it was really a very interesting experience. So then we said, okay, there's a there with this concept. So what do we need to do now to help the hosts to be better hosts and help the guests to be better guests? And that led us to, doing some training with the homestay families, doing some English language training, training some of the local, like younger guys, um, and some gals, but more guys because of the culture, um, in being guides and taking, people from one village to another and handing them off to the next village and things like that, and creating another source of revenue for them. So I think in that kind of a scenario, I mean, we just, we sort of started down this road and thought, okay, this is interesting. Like, let's give it a shot and see what comes of it. And as I said, the homestay experience, in many ways, it's really what sets the path
Yeah.
apart from other places because people don't do that. And we've worked around the religious piece of it in a way that was helpful. And we've had some colleagues who, female colleagues who have said, look, if you're going to make this work, here's how you need to do it. Um, and what was interesting, by the way, with the Palestinians, initially, the Palestinian team was very divided about homestays, and the men were like, nope, not going to happen. And there was one woman who said, this is really important. We need to do this for the families who live in these villages. And the women will be the backbone of these homestays. They will be the ones that get everything done. And um, and we said, let's try it. Let's see what happens if we do that. And she was exactly right. And she was the catalyst. She was the one
Yeah.
who um, made sure that it actually happened in a really good way.
Yeah, no, I would love to share my story.
Mm,
Because I stayed actually with Allison's in-laws
yeah,
outside of Urfa,
yeah,
in their village.
yeah.
And it definitely, at first I was a little nervous,
Mhm.
because bathroom is outside
Yeah.
everything we did was in one room. So that was
Mhm.
the living room, that was where we had our dinner. They, put everything on the floor and all the guests stayed there. And that was also our sleeping room. So they
Yeah.
rolled out these mats and blankets, and it was comfortable.
Hmm.
And I think what you were saying was actually the point I wanted to make as well. I think when the family as a whole, and especially the men, realized that the women were contributing using their skills of hosting and cooking and cleaning, and it was
Yeah.
bringing in money to their family.
Yeah.
I think it changed the dynamic, within the family, between the husband and wife. And in
Mm.
fact, I remember I was leaving for Orfa that morning before everybody else got up, and I'm sitting on the floor outside the kitchen, and her husband was stirring the
Hmm.
yogurt, singing.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I think something has flipped here in a
Mm.
really positive and really powerful way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really unique. And I think it shows people what life is like. And, it was funny when we would sit in the villages and we would drink goat's yogurt, like unpasteurized goat's yogurt. So it was really potent stuff. And it was not, I mean, I got sick every time.
Mm.
And I knew it was just part of the deal. But when we would talk to the people in the village, and they'd say, why would anybody want to come to our village, like from thousands and thousands of miles away? And when we would say they really want to understand your culture and your way of living and things like that that's existed for a long time, they would really be flattered. And it was a respect that was being given to them and their identity and things like that. So I think there were a lot of, when you think about what motivated people to be involved, some people, it was the financial resources. I mean, if you live on a couple dollars a day and somebody's going to come and pay you 30 euro to stay overnight or 40 euro, which is not a lot of money, but to them it is, right? You know, that's one thing. But I think there was also a curiosity that developed. I remember one time I was in the West Bank in Palestine and I was talking to a father and his little son was sort of next to me. I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years old. And I said, why'd you get involved in this? And he said, well, to be honest, like initially it was for the money because we can't go anywhere. We're kind of stuck here. And so, yes, we, tend our farms and things like that, but this kind of thing would help. But he said, what I'm learning by being involved in this project is that um, there's a social dimension here and that we got a lot more people. We've had a lot more travelers over the time since the path has begun to be in existence since 2008. Um, we've had probably about 80, 90,000 people who have walked different parts of the path. Might be for an hour or two, might be for an afternoon, might be for a day, a week, a month, whatever. But um, what you know he said to me was, there were a group of Italians that had just left the village. And when they left, his son turned to his dad and said, Dad, those people don't seem a whole lot different than us. Something like that, right? And his father said, that's one of the things I've really come to value as this about this project is that we can't go places for financial reasons and other kinds of things. And so when these people come, like we're noticing connections. Um, and and I would also say, that a lot of people have gone, more people have gone from Europe than anywhere else because Europeans tend to be a little bit more adventurous, right? About all of this. And so it was nice to hear that and that, and that I don't begrudge anybody for wanting to be involved in something for an economic reason, especially
Mm.
given their situation. But there are these other whys, as we call it. I remember at one point we were talking about what's the why behind the project? And we had our own why, but we had a conversation about, well, what if other people have their own why and their own reason for wanting to be involved? Like, what's wrong with that? Can't these multiple whys coexist? And they did, and we came to embrace that notion that people got involved in this project for a whole host of other reasons.
Yeah, and so you shared financial aspects. You also shared the opportunity that there is a social connection. Were there any other whys from your team or from the hosts and guides on the ground?
There were, it's quite interesting actually. Like one of the biggest training programs we had was in conjunction with Bethlehem University. And so they trained a lot of young Palestinians. And when they would go out to learn to be a guide, they would take them to like the north near Jenin and Ramallah and places like that. And a lot of those young Palestinians had never seen their country. They had never left Bethlehem because, traveling was too difficult. There were checkpoints and all that kind of stuff. And so there was another benefit there that people got to see parts of their own country that they never imagined. And the other one that was really interesting is
Mm.
of all of the countries involved, there was only one that had any history of walking for pleasure, if I can put it that way. Okay, and that was Israel. There was the Israel Trail and things like that. But none of the other countries um, had something like that. In fact, I remember when we were in Turkey, I was with one of my colleagues, and we were walking to do the waymarking and the mapping, and probably five or six people pulled up in their cars and said, "Do you need a ride?" And we said, "No, we want to walk. We're sort of working on a project and whatever." And they said, "Why would you want to walk?" So the notion was that like people didn't walk unless they had to, right? You might have to walk a mile to get water or to tend your sheep or whatever it was. But what was really interesting about that is these hiking clubs began to form in different places. So in Jordan, so what happened was we started sort of working on the Abraham Path, and then people, for example, in Jordan said, you know what, we want to create a national hiking trail all the way across Jordan. And so they did. And probably about 5 or 6 years ago, once the trail was finished, they had a Facebook group of hiking Jordan or something like that, and there were over 100,000 people who had joined the group, and people were going out. Jordanians were going out and walking and things along those lines, which was really, really unexpected. None of us had any sense that that kind of thing would evolve from what we were doing. But it was nice because we began to view the Abraham Path as a cultural route, right? A route, sort of a mythological route that, encompassed a bunch of these trails that people wanted to build. They did the same thing that they created the Sinai Trail in Egypt. They created the Palestinian Heritage Trail, etc. Right? And even in Turkey, the path there is called the Ibrahim Yulu. So there was a way in which people began to find their voice and connect what we were doing to a whole new world for a lot of people.
I think that's amazing. I think you guys have seeded, I think, so many new ideas and opportunities that maybe you guys wouldn't even know about.
No, and it's interesting. Like I was at a gathering of about 35 conflict resolution people in Colorado recently, and we talked about the path at one point, and there was a woman there from Canada, and she said, "Do you think we could create a path, like a reconciliation path between Native Canadians and the rest of society? Because even though there's been rapprochement and reparations and things like that, there's still a feeling like there's a divide." So she and I have been talking about that, working on that. And there's also a place called Bethel Woods, which is on the site of Woodstock. Um, and my wife's grandfather built a house on a lake there in the Catskills back in the 1920s. So we go up there and I got kind of connected with them, and they're starting a whole series of programs related to sort of conflict resolution and depolarization and things like that. And a couple of years back, I came up with the idea of creating a purple path, bringing blue and red together for people from across the political spectrum to walk and talk and try to understand each other a little bit better, which is not happening today, right? And so they're moving ahead. They have like a lot of acreage on the site, and so they're going to create a purple path and promote it and get people coming. So I think, there's a guy named Stephen Heinz who was the executive director of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who was one of the early funders of the path. And he famously sort of said to us, in a world where there are increasingly walls, we need more paths. And that's why we support your work, because we believe that these kinds of routes and these kinds of paths put people in contact in a world where, people are increasingly not in contact, and that people are hiding behind walls and protecting themselves behind walls.
I agree, and I think you rediscover your shared humanity
Yeah.
with people that maybe you're walking with them for an hour or a
Hmm.
day,
Yeah.
or you lose them for a couple of days and you reconvene. I think there's something really powerful about that. And I think I told you I had recently walked part of the Camino Frances
Mm,
in northern Spain. And what was really interesting is that there's something to having nothing to do but
mm,
put on your sneakers, put on a backpack, and just walk. Just
hmm.
the openness. I think the opportunity for reflection, but also just being open to
Yeah.
whatever you discover along the path. It could be people, it could be a unique little church in
Right.
a place that you would have never discovered, or even just looking at the grapes in, in Rioja country.
Yeah.
So I think
No,
there's really something to that slow travel
yeah.
movement.
And that's another dimension to this, which is that, people, I mean, probably about 7 years ago in 2017, 2018, we did a sort of 10-year reunion walk in the West Bank. And there were 25 of us from probably 15 different countries, didn't know each other. And by the end of it, like you've built these bonds and connections because you're walking and talking. When you have to climb up a little hill or a mountain or something, you help each other. And it inevitably creates these bonds and these connections among strangers. It's amazing how that works. And there's a lot of really interesting research as well on the power of walking, and not only how it's good for you health-wise, but in terms of creativity and thinking and the connection. So yeah, there's the bond that develops between the hosts and the guests, but there's also this bond between travelers, because you are vulnerable, as you say. You're walking into a village, like you're walking. You have no protection, and things like that. And it was interesting because people always would say to us, "Are you crazy? You're going to walk across the Middle East? Like, what's wrong with you?" But we've never had an instance uh, where, I mean, the only instances where people have gotten hurt is when they fell hiking and walking, or from dehydration. We've never had an instance. I mean, there have been, places along the path where there might be military or things along those lines, But this is where the local partnerships became so valuable because those people live there. They know the scenario, they know the story on the ground, and they know how to handle that. And so we would always defer to them in terms of the best way to go forward and handle a situation or whatever it might be. But we never really had any incidents because, the other thing we talked about Abrahamic hospitality for people in the region, if you're their guest, like they literally wash your feet. Like it's their obligation to take care of you. And if they fail in that obligation, like it's a shame on their family. And so that's powerful, right? That creates a huge incentive to make sure that you're protected. And they want people to come so they can continue to sort of, prosper and engage in whatever. And so it's also in their interest to make sure that you're safe and that, there aren't challenges that happen that get pushed out into the media and then nobody wants to come.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have just one more question for you. So what's the one question you believe more people should be asking when they're trying to build some bridges across divides, whether it's personal, political, global, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think it simply comes down to the idea of I wonder what they're thinking. I wonder how they see the world because it's not the same as the way you do. And you can't bring your perspective, your orientation, your view of the world to a situation that's very, very different. And so I think if you're always asking, that's not the response, for example, I expected, they must be thinking about this very differently than me. So how can I begin to imagine what they're seeing and thinking, um, so I can understand them better?
That's a great way to end this. I hope more people have the opportunity to walk at least part of the path. And as you explained, I did a day in the West Bank. I think there was a Saturday walk. I did a day there. I
Mhm.
did a day or so in Turkey. So you don't have to do the whole six
Yeah,
countries
right.
in one go. And there are also a variety of accommodations, homestays, like you said, which I enjoyed very much. But
Yeah.
there are also some hotels along the way,
Yeah.
especially places like Urfa.
And there's some great, there's if you Google the Abraham Path Initiative, we've gotten a lot of media attention. Like
Mm,
the Abraham Path was named one of the best new hiking trails in 2014 by National Geographic.
mm,
But also like it was on the cover, the Zagros Mountain Trail, which is in northern Iraq, was on the cover of New York Times Magazine a few years ago as could this kind of a project be something that could change the region?
yeah.
And so, but there's also a lot of other videos and things that are out there that people can watch to get a sense of what this looks like and what the experience is. And I think that's always a good thing because it will surprise you for sure. Because most people have their preconceived notions. And I can tell you this, I've never met somebody when I've talked to them when they've come back that hasn't had their perspective dramatically altered. It's almost impossible because of the nature of the experience and the immersion and everything like that to come away and to not see people in that human way. And, I remember talking to lots of families and they're like, listen, we just want what you want for your kids. Like, we want to send them to school. We want them to have a future. We want them to have an education. Like, that's our goal. That's our dream, just like you. And I think that's, when you meet people like that, it's very hard to vilify them going forward because you always remember the mother who's making bread in the morning telling you this story over an open fire with a smile and a twinkle in her eye and her kids sitting around listening. It humanizes it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even walking with the kids
Hmm?
is great because that's something where while you're killing time, the kids are around and they're happy to be your little tour guides
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah,
Well, thank you so much. I really
sure.
appreciate you taking time and I guess safe travels.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and we are gonna be having more trips going forward now. This is sort of a restarting in a lot of ways of the path after COVID and after some, the regional disruptions and things have settled now. And so we can, certainly get people walking in Turkey and northern Iraq and in Jordan for the time being. And so that's our plan.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we share that information.
Thank you.
Thanks. My gosh, what a fascinating conversation. Before I share a few closing thoughts, I encourage you to take a look at the photo slideshow after my comments. Some of the photos are mine, taken during a homestay in Southeast Turkey, an experience I will never forget. So beyond the incredible stories of how this path came to life, a few takeaways from my conversation with Josh really stayed with me. First, leave space for the not knowing and even embrace it. If the team behind the Abraham Path had rushed to find a quick, obvious solution for where travelers might stay, they would have missed out on something extraordinary. Instead, by staying curious and open, they discovered the idea of homestays. These stays have now become one of the most meaningful parts of the journey, giving travelers a chance to experience authentic hospitality and truly connect with people in the region. Second, let your curiosity be guided by culture. Josh shared how in some countries, once people heard about the Abraham Path, they immediately jumped in and took ownership of it. In others, where systems were a little bit more rigid and people were used to being told what to do, it took more time and encouragement for the idea to take root. By paying attention to cultural context, you can build bridges more thoughtfully and in a way that really honors the history and rhythms of the communities you're engaging with. Finally, a simple but powerful practice. Put yourself in someone else's shoes and ask, I wonder how they see the world. We're all shaped by our own experiences, and it's easy to assume what others are thinking. But when we pause and approach others with genuine curiosity, we open the door to understanding, and that's where the real connection begins. I feel it's worth sharing once again the words of Stephen Hines of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, one of the funders of the Abraham Path Initiative. In a world where there are increasingly walls, we need more paths. So, as you watch the photos of this beautiful path, think about the bridges you can build in your own life and community. Sometimes the first step is simply being willing to walk alongside someone with an open heart and curious mind.